Welcome to a Telltale Books video. I'm Greg and I'm going to continue my new series on discussing everything I can get my hands on in order of publication by Fritz Leiber, the great American science fiction and fantasy and horror author. And not a lot of people know this, but Fritz Leiber's father was a noted silent film actor, Shakespearean actor as well. And Fritz Leiber Jr. himself, also did get involved in Hollywood a little bit, but he mostly worked as a writer in the um, science fiction, fantasy, and horror genres. He is generally considered a science fiction writer, but his science fiction output, I think, is really eclipsed by his fantasy and horror output. He did write quite a bit for Weird Tales, and his most famous series of stories is the Fafhrd and Grey Mouser series, which was his very first story publication in Unknown magazine, the fantasy companion to Astounding Stories. That was published in August of 1939 and is generally called The Jewels in the Forest, although it also has been published as Two Sod Adventure. And that whole series is just really good. It's been extremely influential on modern fantasy, especially Dungeons and Dragons, very famous fantasies. And Leiber wrote plenty of other fantasy and horror stories, including his second published short story. This is a short story called The Automatic Pistol. This story was published in the next year, in May of 1940, and this got published. This was his first story to appear in Weird Tales magazine, which, of course, is the magazine which predates Amazing Stories. It was started in 1923 and published for a very long time. It still does pop up every now and then. Somebody tries to revise it and publishes a few issues and then runs out of money or something, and they stop publishing. The most recent incarnation was still being published as recently as 2021, though I haven't heard anything from it since then. So the automatic pistol, I'm going to give you a very brief synopsis because it is a short story and it has kind of a twist ending, though it's not. I don't feel I describe a lot of these stories with twist endings as being very much like Twilight Zone episodes. This one, I don't think, had the feel of a Twilight Zone episode. This had very much classic early Weird Tales feel about it. Not the Lovecraft, Howard, Clark Ashton Smith kind of Weird Tales, but the rest of what Weird Tales published. Um, this was very much along those lines. Anyway, you got a guy named Inky, and he's a member of a gang of bootleggers during Prohibition. Okay, Prohibition hadn't been that far in the past at the time this story was published. And the bootleggers, of course, were people. Interesting history about bootlegging. They were people who would transport alcohol coming into the country on the Atlantic coast in the south, or in the Gulf of Mexico, and they would transport it through the southern states to wherever it needed to go, wherever speakeasies were looking for it. And the drivers of these cars, they were driving cars, they had to outrun the police cars. So they got very, very good at driving very, very fast. And it is actually when bootlegging became unnecessary because the prohibition was repealed, These drivers formed NASCAR, some of them anyway, and became the very first NASCAR race drivers. Kind of interesting. I didn't know that until I saw it on I think it was History Channel show that was talking about it. Anyway, Inky is one of the members of a gang of bootleggers, and the other guys in the gang are noticing that Inky has this unusual attachment to his automatic pistol. And they remarked, guys, they needed those pistols and in the kind of dangerous work they did, cutthroat work that they did. And so they took really good care of their pistols, but they didn't like talk to it or pet the pistol or things like that. Inky did. And he filed the trigger to a hair trigger. I forget what part it is. There's a part on a pistol on a gun that if you file it down, you don't have to put much pressure on the trigger in order to get it to fire. And Inky had this filed down to where the pistol could almost fire itself. So his gun was very distinctive. It was different from every other gun, and the other bootleggers, they remarked that they could always identify Inky's gun. Well, then Inky gets killed. Somebody kills Inky, and one of the bootleggers turns up with Inky's gun. That's when things get weird. Um, I can't say anything more than that without just totally blowing this story for all of you. I would say go out and find it and read it. Um, I have seen the May 1940 issue of Weird Tales online as a PDF for free. I read The Automatic Pistol in my copy of the Great Science Fiction Stories, Volume 2, covering 1940 by Isaac Asimov and Martin H. Greenberg. Even though it wasn't a science fiction story, they were impressed with it enough that they included it in this book. And so I read this story way, way back in 79, I think this book was published. 1979, August of 1979 is when this book was printed. And I've actually read this volume of the Great Science Fiction Stories 2 or 3 times previously, and now I'm going through it again. It's just an excellent collection of short stories. If pretty sure you can find this used. Might cost you $15 or $20, but it's worth it. It's well worth it. These stories are the best. And the automatic pistol is very good, although I don't feel it impressed me enough to give it a top tail. It's another one of it's another one of those stories though that just falls short. It's really good, but not quite, not quite great, in my opinion. Asimov thought it was great. Who am I to dispute Isaac Asimov? But I'm not putting it in my top tails list. I think there are some other Fritz Leiber stories that are more deserving of that list than this one. But it's a very good story. I do recommend it if you like weird stories, if you like horror stories. Uh, this is a really good one by someone who was a master of fantasy at a time when fantasy was in a weird place. I mean, before Weird Tales, fantasy was fairy tales. Seriously. Almost all fantasy books were just fairy tales. You had some people that harked back to the old English epics that tried to write their own epics like William Morris, and that was great. But the vast majority were fairy tales. And the rest were horror writers like William Hope Hodgson and H.P. Lovecraft, eventually, Edgar Allan Poe. And they weren't really writing fantasy, they were writing horror. There might have been some fantasy overtones. Um, there was a minority of writers like Lord Dunsany and Abraham Merritt that were writing fantasy, which was more adult. H. Rider Haggard with the novel She kind of falls in that group also, as well as Edgar Rice Burroughs, although Burroughs was writing more fantastical adventures, not straight out fantasy. So the kind of fantasy that Leiber wrote in Fafhrd and the Grey Mouse, or that Robert Howard wrote in Weird Tales, this was something that it only existed in those pulp magazines. It didn't exist outside of that. And for a long time, wouldn't exist outside of that. And so Fritz Leiber was one of those that was really pioneering a whole new genre. Fantasy and horror at this time didn't really exist as genres the way science fiction did. They were being built at this time, but they still didn't get the acceptance that science fiction did when Amazing Stories came out. You didn't have horror conventions or fantasy conventions. You had science fiction fans doing science fiction conventions, and oh, by the way, they also read Weird Tales and Unknown. So, worth your time to track it down. I'm sure it's in some short story collections that Fritz Leiber published over the years. And maybe in some ebooks on Kindle that you can find and pick up. And most of the time those will be $1.99 or at most $4.99. You're not going to be paying $14.99 for classic science fiction collection like that. So look it up and try, give them a try. And if you haven't read anything else by Leiber, definitely read something by Leiber. If nothing else, read Fafhrd and the Grey Mouse series, but also try some of these others by Leiber. It's worth your time. He is definitely one of the best writers at this period in time. Other authors like Asimov had great ideas, but Leiber had great atmosphere and great characters. That again, the characters in the story are awesome. So if you read The Automatic Pistol or Leiber, or want to make any other comment about this story or Leiber or 1940 or whatever, leave comments. And I hope you'll like this video, subscribe to our channel, and come on back for the rest of my dive into Fritz Leiber, which will continue with The Bleak Shore, unless I can get a hold of his earlier ones. The Automatic Pistol on my list is number 8. Jewels in the Forest, his first published fantasy story, is number 7. He did 6 stories before that are not science fiction fantasy, and if I come across them, I'll backtrack and cover those. But otherwise, The Bleak Shore will be next, and that is going back to Fafhrd and the Grey Mouse again. I hope you'll join me for that. I'll be here talking about it.